been two questions stuck in my mind for a while now, and one of them is, are Cine lenses also for beginner and intermediate filmmakers? And the second one is, could a Cine lens paired with the tiny ZV-E1 that I have possibly be the tiniest cinema camera on the market? Now technically the ZV-E1 is not a cinema line camera from Sony, but it shares the same sensor as the FX3, which is in the Cine line. So if you stretch it a little bit, maybe. So I set out to answer these questions. But before I got my hands on a Cine lens, I wanted to figure out what the differences actually are. So in case you don't know, let's just rapid fire it very quickly. The first thing you will notice when you look at Cine lenses compared to photo lenses are that they are in T-stop instead of f-stop. So f-stop, as far as I understand, is relative to the opening of the hole in the lens itself, which can vary, believe it or not, between lenses in photography lenses. And it doesn't matter that much because when we're taking photos, we can adjust the settings and compensate for changing exposures, or if we change lenses, if the f2.8 is not the exact same on both lenses, it doesn't really matter as much. But when we are in cinematography and commercials and we have multiple cameras running and we switch out lenses, it's pretty important that the exposure stays the same so that we don't have to change the lighting setup and everything. I say we, I'm not a commercial filmmaker, but that's my understanding at least. The T-stops are the actual light that's transmitted through the lens, and it's the same thing across all T-stop lenses. So if you have T4 on one lens and T4 on another lens, it's going to let in the exact same amount of light, which is super handy when you're switching out lenses or if you're shooting on multiple cameras and you have the same lighting setup, knowing that the exposure is going to be the same no matter what you change around. And again, it doesn't matter as much in photos, but it matters in video because the exposure and the light we capture has to be pretty accurate because it's more fragile in video in general. The second thing you will see as a difference is usually how they're distributed in weight and size. Now, photo lenses come in all different kind of sizes and shapes and zooms, and big and heavy ones and tiny primes, and it really differs a lot. And when you swap them out on a gimbal, if you're using them for video, that can be quite a struggle sometimes because you have to rebalance the gimbal if this lens has changed too much. So it's not always the case. You can find lenses that will lie in the same ballpark, both in size and in weight, but it is usually or often a struggle that you will encounter. Whereas Cine lenses, if you buy a set of lenses from the same brand within the same series of lenses, they will most likely have the exact same size and weight, no matter if it's a 20mm, a 30mm, a 60mm, whatever it is. They will usually have the same size and weight, or at least within a few grams of difference, so that it doesn't matter if you're changing them out of whatever rig you're shooting on or whatever gimbal you have it on, it'll still stay balanced the exact same. And that's super handy when we're shooting video, especially on higher productions, but also just in general if you're using a gimbal or something, to be able to swap it out and not have to recalibrate or redo everything. So that's one of the main differences. You will also mostly see Cine lenses be primes. You can get some zoom lenses in Cine lenses as well. They're usually quite expensive, but most of them are in primes, which also gives you less distortion and a much higher quality of the image. Which kind of leads us into the third thing, third thing. That is the sharpness. So photo lenses are usually very digital sharp because when we're taking photos, we want the sharpest possible image that we can get. And when we're making videos, it's not necessarily that it's different from that. We also want a sharp image, but we don't want it over sharpened and digitally sharp because it just doesn't look that natural. So Cine lenses often tends to have a softer roll off, softer edges a little bit, still super sharp and no doubt about that, but they just tend to be a little bit softer to the look and to the touch, which just makes them a little bit more flattering when we're shooting video. And then the last thing, which will probably keep most beginners from jumping into Cine lenses, are that most Cine lenses you'll find with manual focus only. And the main difference here is that, of course, photo lenses have autofocus, and that's great. And I think we've come to a certain age and time where autofocus is so good that it kind of feels silly to not use autofocus. But when you try to manual focus on a photo lens, if you need to do that for some reason, it's still by wire. As far as I understand, that means that it's still the camera doing most of the work and kind of making an approximation of how far in the distance things are. You can also spin the focus or the focus wheel around as much as you want to. So it's not really as set as compared to when you're shooting on a Cine lens that'll most likely have mechanical focus, meaning that it's hard stops from each end and also set in distance. So you can, for example, set it to 1 meter in focus distance, and that means if you measure from the sensor of the camera 1 meter forward, then you will have everything there exactly in focus. And that's super handy when you're shooting commercials or movies, that you can measure those things out and you can pull focus. And I'm not an expert in that, but I believe that's why it is that way. So to explore if a Cine lens is also something for me, which I don't consider myself a professional filmmaker yet in sense of shooting commercials or movies, anything like that. I'm more like a professional YouTuber, filmmaker, I've learned everything myself kind of guy. So I was curious and I reached out to IRIX, said, hey, what about we do something together? We see if we can make a couple of videos where we maybe introduce Cine lenses a bit more to the beginner or intermediate markets, or at least let me test them out so I can see if that could work. And I've got the lens here. They were super, super kind to send me the 65mm T1.5 Cine lens that they have in their lineup. And I've had it for a little bit more than a month now, and I've tested it out in various conditions. So let's just talk quickly about it. One of the things you'll see with Cine lenses as well is that the build quality is really good. Cine lenses are usually in like aluminum or some kind of metal, so they're really built to last and take a beating, and usually also sealed for all weather conditions. I believe that IRIX just got the certification on these lenses that these are like a military grade weather sealing now, so they can go down to like -40 degrees. And super hot as well. So build quality wise, they're really built to last and stand all kind of conditions that you could put them into. It's T1.5, so it can let in a ton of light. I don't know what that is compared to f-stops, but I've been shooting in very dark conditions and very bright, and I can shoot pretty much anything that I would like to. It also has a magnetic thread up here, which is built in. So if you get the IRIX Edge ND, I have the 2 to 5 stop. They were super kind to send me as well. You can just slap that on and then you have ND on as well, which is super, super handy, and I really loved doing that. The outside thread is 95mm, meaning that you can put a matte box on. That's not for me, it's too big and clunky. I don't really like that. I don't have to impress any clients with a matte box, so I don't really care too much about that. And the inside is 86mm, which is not the standard size for filter threads. So that's why I asked if they could send me the ND filter that just slaps on magnetically as well. No need for adapters or anything to put on to make that ND work. So yeah, I just love that a lot. And other than that, you can pull the focus here manually. You have the hard stops, and it's just a really well-built lens. But let's jump into the 3 questions that I had to discover or figure out if a Cine lens is something for me, and if it's something beginners could use, and if I could possibly turn a ZV-E1 into the tiniest possible cinema camera. I had 3 questions. Does the image actually look different? Is it still travel friendly in terms of size and weight and how it's usable? And lastly, the elephant in the room, is it actually doable to manual focus for someone like me that's really a run and gun shooter and films myself a lot and films vlog style and all kind of different types of videos? Does that make sense with manual focus? So over the last months, I've been exploring these questions while using this lens in all kind of different conditions that I could find. I've been shooting at sunsets, sunrises, I've taken it out in the middle of the day where there's very harsh lighting, and I even took it on a 6.5 hours hike up a mountain to shoot with it, just to see how it holds up with the way that I'm shooting. So the first question I wanted to figure out was, does the image actually look different coming out of this lens? And the short answer is yes, but I haven't been able to pinpoint exactly why that is. It could be because it's a tighter focal length at 65mm, and I normally shoot at a variety of 24 to 70, all in between that range. It could be because it's a prime, so it just produces a different image because it has less moving elements and it's just higher quality in that regard. And it could potentially be just because it's a different lens, but there is something to the look. It kind of just looks a little bit more three-dimensional, the image that comes out of this, and I absolutely love it. So image quality wise, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but there is something different about it. And I actually prefer the look that comes out of this lens so far. to what I normally shoot that I prefer to have this on as much as possible to shoot with it. And it's just more fun, probably because it's something different. That's a part of it, but it really has been fun and different to shoot with this lens. The second question I wanted to answer was, is it still travel friendly? Can I still take it through my travels? If you don't know, I travel full time and I've been doing so for almost 3 years now. And I kind of needed a minimal setup, which is why I got the ZV-E1 a few months ago in the first place, because I wanted a tiny camera. And pairing it with a little bit of a bigger lens that weighs a little bit more than my normal photography lenses, I was curious to see if that would make a big difference in terms of traveling. And that's why I took it on a 6.5 hours hike up a mountain to see, is it still possible to carry it up like that? And I will say yes and no. The weight, if I had to have like a set of 3 lenses, because it's not a zoom, would definitely be more. But because of the image that we just talked about that comes out of it is a little bit better, or I like it more, it could be worth it. Hiking 6.5 hours up and down a mountain was no problem at all. I just had it on the camera in a sling around my shoulder, and it was absolutely no problem shooting with it like that. We'll come to manual focus in a second, so I won't talk about that here. But in general, it was just fun to use. It was a fun challenge, and while hiking up a mountain, I can't see myself as much switching out lenses all the time, but then I would probably bring a 30mm or something like that. Or if it's a more commercial shoot, then it would make sense to bring more lenses. So travel friendliness in terms of moving around a lot, maybe not as much, but having a set of only 3 of these or 2 could definitely make sense. So it's a check mark, definitely. And because it's paired with this tiny camera, it's still a small footprint. The thing that I will say is that because it weighs a little bit more, it comes in around 13 or 1400 grams, depending on what lens mount you have on it, which is one thing that I forgot to say earlier. IRIX has pretty much all the popular lens mounts for the lenses as well, which makes it super handy if you're shooting on Canon or on Sony or whatever it might be. You can pretty much get a mount that fits to that. I'll put the mounts here, and that's just really, really handy in terms of getting the one that fits your camera instead of having to use adapters. That's something that would have restricted me or kept me off using a Cine lens as well if I had to adapt it to my camera first, because then I have to switch out a lot more when I switch between lenses. So travel friendly wise, carrying around, not a problem. Traveling around with a lot of them and switching them out on a shoot, we'll see in the future if I get more lenses, how that works, but I won't say it's a no-go for me. It's definitely just been fun to shoot this way as well. And then the last question, the elephant in the room, the reason why most people will probably not get a Cine lens or try it out is because of the manual focus. And I personally realized after using this lens that I've been too dependent on autofocus on my cameras ever since I started filming. And if you've tried filming with manual focus on a photo lens and thought it was difficult, I understand that, because it is something completely different. Shooting with manual focus on a Cine lens is a lot easier than it sounds if you haven't tried it. The smooth ring here is super easy to use and makes it very easy to do smooth movements, and you have to move it a lot less than you might think. So pulling focus, if the subject is moving a little bit, is actually a lot easier. The main problem I've had is that the LCD screen on my ZV-E1 is not the largest. So being able to see what's actually in focus and using the focus peaking is still somewhat of a thing that I play around with, but I've tackled that with 2 things. One is, if I'm in doubt, I just shoot a little bit at a higher t-stop, so like T4, to still get bokeh, and because it's a longer focal length than this one, that's not been a problem. And the second thing I've done is just use the focus magnification on the camera to zoom in first, make sure everything looks sharp and clean, and then I can zoom out again. And sometimes I've even had it on while I've been recording, just to get that extra comfort that things are actually in focus. And I've had some hit and misses, but if I'm being honest, I've had a lot of hit and miss with the autofocus as well. And the thing is, here I'm in full control when I'm shooting with manual focus. I decide what's in focus. It's my fault if I mess it up or if I go the wrong way, which I've been tending to do sometimes. But when I'm shooting with autofocus, if the autofocus in the camera suddenly starts focusing on something different, there's nothing that I can do, and it just looks weird, whereas that's less likely to happen when you're shooting with manual focus, because you decide what's in focus. And when I was doing the 6.5 hours hike, I actually got some shots that I wouldn't normally have gotten, because it's super difficult to do that with autofocus compared to manually focusing and then just deciding what's going to be in focus and what's not. And then trying to pull focus was sometimes hit and miss. And especially because I've been trying to do it handheld. So I haven't rigged it out with a follow focus. I haven't rigged out my camera, because that's kind of the idea of having like the tiniest possible cinema camera for me is that it's super lightweight and easy to carry around. So I've just been using my left hand to both control the iris, the T-stops, and my thumb or my other finger to try and do the focus. And it's been working pretty well, to be honest. As said, it's super easy to focus with a lens like this, so I wouldn't be afraid of that. Rather, as I've said, I've had shots that's been ruined with autofocus because the camera suddenly started focusing on something different without me knowing it. So if I've left the camera and tried to frame something, I come back and then it started focusing on a leaf or something grass in the foreground all of a sudden because it thought that was prettier than what I wanted. Cameras are dumb, they don't know what you want, so the more you can shoot in manual, whether it comes to aperture, shutter speed, white balance, ISO, everything, the more you can shoot in manual, the more control you have and the easier it makes it to shoot. Now, I could put a monitor on to make it easier to focus, and I do have a 7-inch monitor, but it just becomes a little bit too big on this tiny camera. So I'm looking to get a 5.5 or a 6-inch monitor at some point, just to make it a little bit smaller, the footprint on my camera, and make it a bit easier. And that'll make the focusing so much easier and no problem at all. I'm sure of that already, because when I've been using the 7-inch, it's not been a problem at all. So let's get to the final verdict of this lens and what I thought of it after using it for more than a month. And you've seen some footage while I've been talking about it that I've shot with this lens as well, so you can kind of get your own impression of what you think of the look of it. But I will say that I absolutely love it, and you might have already gotten that sense throughout the video that I actually prefer shooting with this. Now, the manual focus is the biggest thing that makes it a little bit difficult sometimes, especially if I want to be in front of the camera myself. But going at a little bit of a higher T-stop and then just focusing on a specific part, then I also know when I walk into that part or stand in that specific place, I will be in focus. And that's also kind of comforting sometimes. It's just finding that spot can sometimes be a little bit difficult. That's really the only small thing that I've had with this lens, and that's kind of just my style of shooting. If you're mostly behind the camera, I think this is a great way to shoot for a lot of people, and relying on autofocus is not always as reliable. And I find that I often miss shots that I want to get with autofocus because it starts focusing on something else, and it's quite frustrating compared to focusing or doing everything myself. So thank you, IRIX, for sending me this lens and letting me test it out. If you have any questions about Cine lenses, or whether it's for you or not, or something that you feel like I didn't answer in this video, leave them down below, and I'm super happy to hang out in the comments and potentially make some more videos about this lens, comparing it to something else, or answering your questions if there's something that you feel is missing. But thank you so much for watching. If you watched all the way through, I really appreciate you, and I'll see you soon. And until the next time, take care.